This is on, right? Okay, great. Welcome, everybody. I'm Avik Roy. Nice to be with you all. It's great to see so many friends and so many, hopefully, new friends here today. As Heath mentioned, I was involved, and the two other panelists are signatories of a document we put out last summer called the Freedom Conservatism Statement of Principles. And just to give you some background on it, so I run a think tank called the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity. We focus on how to use economic freedom to help lower and middle income Americans. And I and many others and the people in this room, we've all obviously watched with alarm, not only as the Republican Party has been transformed by recent events and changes to the leadership of the Republican Party, but there's been actually a deeper problem that we were concerned with, which is that there's a group of intellectuals who are trying to turn Trump into Trumpism, right? Who are trying to turn what Trump is doing into an ideology that hijacks or transforms what the conservative movement stands for and changes it in certain ways from what it has stood for since Bill Buckley and Ronald Reagan and Barry Goldwater built the conservative movement in the 20th century. And that's not to say that the conservative movement of the 20th century was perfect, that there weren't blind spots or ways to improve that movement. But the core idea that the thing that we are trying to conserve is constitutional government. The thing that we're trying to preserve is a country in which people are free to pursue their dreams. That was the thing that we really wanted to conserve and to rally together the group of people who still stood for those things. Because 2 years ago, there was an effort by a group called the National Conservatives, some of the people who are trying to evolve conservatism in a different way. They produced something called the National Conservatism Statement of Principles, which states a number of principles, many of which a lot of us would agree with, but some of which maybe we wouldn't. And they had kind of presented themselves as, hey, like if you are coming out of college, if you're joining Capitol Hill, if you're working on a campaign, this is now what conservatives are signing up for. And so the whole idea was to say, hey, wait a minute, we stand for some principles of our own, and we want to give people the choice. If you look at the National Conservative Statement and that's what you want and that's what you believe in, then go to town. But if it's the more traditional form of American conservatism that you support, then here's a menu that you can subscribe to. And we were very fortunate and honored to have a number of the people here sign on, a number of the people in the room, like Heath and others. You can learn more about it at freedomconservatism.org if you're interested in taking a look at what we've done. It's very similar, by the way, to the Principles First Declaration of Principles that's posted outside. A lot of overlap between those two documents. And so we have two panelists here along with myself. We have, of course, Ramesh, who's the editor of National Review, who is a signatory, who writes a lot about both politics and policy, and is also a senior fellow, is it at AEI? Resident fellow? I always get the terms.
That sounds right.
Something like that at the American Enterprise Institute. And Jessica Melugin, who is a tech policy scholar at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, which is also a libertarian, classical liberal think tank here in Washington. And so I thought what we could do is maybe talk about some of the, we all have slightly different backgrounds. I'm, both in the politics and policy world, but more on the policy side. Ramesh is probably a little bit the mirror image of that, a little bit more on the politics side. A regular commentator, of course, at PBS NewsHour, along with his duties at National Review, and then Jessica as the classic think tank scholar, And there's a lot of things to talk about with this whole topic of freedom, conservatism, and the future of conservatism, and where it differs from and what it has in common with these other strains of conservatism. And maybe I'll start with you, Ramesh, because we were talking prior to this event, and we had a kind of a dialogue at National Review when we launched the statement, and I was making pointed criticisms of the nationalists, and you were politely and gently tweaking me for that, saying I was being a little too tough on them, and that there's a coalition to be built there, or that there are a lot of things about national conservatism that are perfectly within the conservative tradition that we should try to preserve. So tell us a little bit about that. Tell us about your take on all this.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you all for having me. It is so nice to be at a conference where nobody is holding a straw poll that is won by Vivek Ramaswamy, tying with Kristi Noem. I suspect that if we were nominating either of those individuals for something, it would not be the vice presidency. So I guess the thing that I would say about the sort of National Conservative Manifesto, as Avik was saying, there is much of it that I think a lot of us would agree with, and a lot of it I do agree with. I just think that national conservatism has been better in theory than in practice. In this sense, you could agree with, so I have reservations about the manifesto, but you could have no reservations about the manifesto. You could agree with it entirely while still thinking it is an unwise idea to put in office somebody who has tried to subvert the constitutional order, has poor impulse control, and has in fact called for terminating the Constitution. The disagreements, the reasons that I reject Donald Trump go beyond things that the National Conservatives believe in. I don't agree with the National Conservatives or Trump on protectionism and trade, for example. But I could live with a protectionist president. America has had plenty of protectionist presidents in its past. A president who tries to overturn an election, that's a different thing entirely. And so I think it's important to keep that in mind.
Yeah, I think you're hitting on something, Ramesh, there that's really important, which is a lot of the commentary about national conservatism versus freedom conservatism is about literally comparing the two statements line by line and saying, oh, well, the two statements have a lot of overlap. These two groups must not be that different. And what you're alluding to is that there's a lot more to a political movement than a bunch of words you put on paper. Especially, I would argue, for the National Conservatives, where a large part of why they put that statement on paper is because they were getting a lot of flack for some of the extremist things that nationalists were saying, and they wanted to kind of put out this statement to say, hey, we're not all crazy racist extremists, we also have like normal views. Whereas I think for us, at least this is my biased view, perhaps, is that for us, the things we put on paper were very important to us. We're trying to say, hey, this is what we stand for. The federal debt is a really important problem we have to solve. Freedom is an important principle to uphold, and that is the thing that has made America great. Individual liberty is the thing that has made America great. We have to address the economic challenges that lower middle income Americans have using economic freedom. And that's something that we who believe in freedom have to do. We can't simply say Trump is a bad guy or that free trade is good. We have to actually show how these policies are relevant to ordinary people. Because if you don't do that, they're going to go to the people who are claiming that their ideas are relevant.
So, yeah, I think, well, look, the friends and foes of national conservatism have a tendency to flatten the history of conservatism, of Reaganite or traditional conservatism, and make it out to be just kind of libertarian extremism plus warmongering. And look, the mainstream conservative tradition has always had a great appreciation of markets and decentralization, but it's certainly also been concerned with national sovereignty and cultural cohesion and the maintenance of an ethical tradition. And so sometimes you see national conservatives sort of caricaturing the past of conservatism, but sometimes you also see conservatives who reject national conservatism going to the other extreme and thinking, well, if I don't like national conservatism, I don't like any of that either.
What would you say, as somebody who's involved in these conversations, what's your best advice for those of us who believe in these principles? What are the things that we should be doing to advance these principles?
Well, you've done a great job of organizing a manifesto to start with, and this conference, I'm sure, has done a lot to talk about some of the challenges before our country. I really do think that a lot of part of what happened to conservatism is that we grew a little bit rigid. We started deciding that the solutions of 1981 were not just the solutions to the challenges of 1981, but good at all times and all places. And conservatism really does have to renew itself constantly by applying old principles to new circumstances. That's something that you were just talking about, but I think it's vitally important. And one of the things that happened to conservatism that left this door open for a kind of noxious neoliberal politics was that we had stopped doing that for too long.
That's a great segue to your work, Jessica.
Sadly so.
Yeah, I mean, because in so many ways, first of all, you work on technology policy, which is a great example of something that's different today than 1981. But also, it's an area where the nationalists have had a critique. The nationalists argue that, for example, you have Google, you have Twitter, you have these big tech companies that have been captured by left-wing interests and are advancing, particularly on the cultural side, left-wing culture and imposing that on our kids. And unless we basically regulate those companies or have some way for the government to tell them what to do and what not to do, we will lose these rising generations to left-wing philosophy.
Yeah, they've been really effective, I think, at convincing people of that narrative. And because sadly I spend all day, all week doing it, I will just impart to you a few other things to think of. Certainly there are things you can have a problem with these companies doing, and you can not agree with their political opinions, but I will remind you that 8 of the top 10 global tech companies are US companies. There's not one in Europe, not one. And not only is that just awesome, because we're amazing in America, but it's also important to getting there first, being there first, setting the standards. Again, these companies aren't perfect, but if you go across the pond and you look at what they don't have a First Amendment, if you look at what speech looks like there and what these companies are subjecting themselves and their users to, it really is some healthy perspective on what's happening in the US. We are so much better off that US companies lead the world, not just economically, and all your 401ks are better off for it. The Magnificent Seven is no joke. But culturally, it's a better default than what might be coming out of China. So I think that's something to keep in mind when you hear the negative. It's not the narrative. It's not perfect. There's been problems, but as we learned with the Twitter files, a lot of those problems came from the government's interference in what these companies were.
Elaborate on that for people who haven't been following that. So what was it that the government actually did?
Well, they sent some pretty strongly worded emails to these tech companies saying, hey, we don't really like what you're letting roll around on your platform in terms of everything from election information, true or not, COVID information, true or not. I don't want to risk my organization's 50C3 status, so I won't get into if they're true or not, let you decide for yourself. But there was government pressure for these companies to hide or remove content. And what was really encouraging about it when you got into those exchanges that I believe were FOIA'd and are now the source of a lawsuit, is that the companies actually pushed back a lot harder than you may think. They really said, we don't really need to take that down. We feel fine about that. And what the government said, not explicitly, but there's going to be an argument in court that it was enough to be problematic, was, that's a real nice tech company you have there. It would be a shame if something happened to it. And that in the context of Section 230, which are these companies' liability protections being threatened to be removed in Congress, and a number of antitrust cases at the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission, you can see how that would be a real threat to these companies' bottom line. They can't
explain what Section 230 is.
Section 230 is part of the 1996 Communications Act, and you won't hear this a lot of places, but I promise you it's the truth. It was actually a bipartisan measure, and what had happened was, what was going on at the time in technology, speaking of adapting to change and applying conservative and free market principles, there were these message boards. I don't know how many of you remember that, but before social media, remember the message boards? And there were sort of 2 competing models. One of the message boards was like, it's a free-for-all. It's the Wild West. Put it up, let it ride, whatever information is up there, whatever smut is up there, whatever libel is up there, we're not touching it. And because of how liability law worked at the time, that meant you couldn't really sue the platform because they said, we don't know what's up there, we don't look, we don't touch it, we don't do anything. So that was a safe way for them to proceed to be able to host all of our speech. A different billboard said, actually, there's some smut up here and there's some stuff we don't want up here and we want families to use this and kids to use this, so we're gonna start pulling it down. We're going to start getting rid of that stuff. So it's a more welcoming place for who our audience is. And they got in trouble because the liability law said if you're hosting and you know what's up there, you're liable for it if it's problematic. So Chris Cox and Ron Wyden, both congressmen at the time from different parties, came together and said, well, we don't want this new internet thing to turn into Smutsville and violence, and we want people to be able to use this for learning and education, all these things. So they said, what if we made the law explicitly to say, you as the poster of content are legally responsible for what you say or what you post. The person who hosts, the company that hosts that is not. And that's how we're gonna do it. And that's big bad Section 230. It's just placing the onus of responsibility legally on the speaker, not on the host. Very controversial now. Courts have kind of expanded that definition a little bit. I won't bore you with too much more, but that's how Section 230 works. And you can imagine now that these big companies, they would not be able to host all of our speech if they were on the legal hook. There's billions of posts a day. It's not like a letter to the editor and the newspaper doesn't print it because they don't patrol it before it goes up. You put it up, and then if there's a problem, they can pull it down if they have a problem with it.
And the argument from local newspapers is that puts them at a structural disadvantage because everything you put in the local newspaper is subject to litigation. You are editorially responsible for it, but these big tech platforms, these websites, don't have that same. They have this total safe harbor. They can do whatever. They can put all this stuff up and not be legally liable, and that. The local newspapers argue that has created a massive economic advantage for the big tech companies, and that's a big reason why local newspapers are dying on the vine.
I think there's a lot of reasons local newspapers are dying on the vine, but that is certainly a difference. But I will just say to you, what a newspaper publishes is usually that's an amount of information they can patrol. They are proactively publishing it. So it's just a little bit structurally different. What's great about social media is that it's the biggest expansion of speech for all of us in the history of mankind. What's bad about it is all the stuff that's bad about that, right? It's all of us online. The good, the bad, the wildly inappropriate. It's nothing that's not us. It's nothing that's not, hopefully it's not things you would say online at the grocery store, but I don't know you, maybe you would too. Anonymity and distance makes people a little more obnoxious than they should be, and that's a real thing. But for the newspaper side, they're controlling what they put out there. That's a different model than social media platforms. And I will note that the New York Times comment section, where you're posting, enjoys those same Section 230 liability protections as well. So nothing against local media, love the journalists, but traditional media was a little slow to get with the program on all of this. And that's not good or bad, that's just some of that tension between those two platforms is now still manifesting in these policy fights.
I bring up these two lines of questioning because the criticism of the national conservatives is that there's two different things. There's a Natcon criticism, which is that if Google wants to put out this new AI bot called Gemini that's very left wing, and we're okay with that because it's a private company that can do whatever it wants, but Google has so much market power that if they put out something left-wing, it's going to really transform the country, arguably. And our only response to that as freedom conservatives is, well, they're a private company, they can do whatever they want. That's not good enough. That's something the Natcons would say. Go ahead.
I think, and I do think, like on a very principled level, that is my reaction. It's a private company, and for me, the mess of getting the government involved in patrolling speech is not worth whatever the benefit would be. But on a more practical level, I think that we also we're all sitting around talking about how awful Gemini is right now. Like, we know when the
For those who don't know,
fathers,
Google Gemini is like the ChatGPT version that Google is putting out.
And it makes images. And last week there was a lot of news around the fact that it was producing crazy images. Like, the founding fathers were portrayed as African American. Not great. Gemini, not accurate. Like,
I think they programmed them by running Hamilton too many times.
Yes. I am tired of Hamilton, it's true. But a couple things. One, we're all talking about how ridiculous it is, and to me that's a pretty good market signal that we're not all lobotomy victims who can't realize when things are ridiculous and biased. And two, Google's pulled Gemini this week. It's not available. You can't go do it right now. I would make all of you do it so we could laugh at all the ridiculous things it would produce. So, I'm not here to tell you that the market is perfect and always produces the perfect result. I'm here to say that once you get government involved, you're getting a lot of other problems involved. and you're also blocking what the market correction is.
And the good news is that people want an AI that's accurate, and hopefully, so long as there's a competitive market for AI, which there is at the moment, hopefully that will continue, then there are opportunities for other people to come in and produce it better.
I think the failure here is the incentive for the next company to come along and give you something you are happy with, and I like that incentive.
And the other thing I just want to make sure I emphasize or point out is the reason I brought up the point about the local papers is that there is a line of thinking, which I am sympathetic to, that a big reason why our politics is so polarized now is because local papers, which were kind of a bulwark of non-polarized coverage, are gone. Like, people used to hate, the national coverage, but they would like their local paper. And the local papers tend to cover things like what's going on in the schools and what's going on in the parks that weekend. And it was just a lot less political. And we've lost a lot of that journalism in this environment that we're in. And somehow we have to find a way to get it back. Let's go this way. We've been talking about what are the Natcon criticisms of the conventional, the traditional conservative movement. Let's flip it around. So Ramesh, tell us what are the things about the nationalist movement that you are most concerned about?
Well, Jessica sort of brought this up obliquely when she talked about America being awesome. In theory,
awesome, Ramesh.
a national conservatism is a conservatism that is motivated by pursuing our national interest, strengthening our national sense of solidarity. But in practice, a lot of national conservatives seem either to be more in love with an idea of America than with the actual country we live and our actual neighbors and fellow citizens. And sometimes they seem besotted with an idea of Hungary or Russia instead of the United States. There's something, I think that what they talk about in terms of fostering a sense of national belonging, I think that is something we need in our politics, but it's not something that they actually supply. They often seem motivated more by by anger and resentment about modern America. Things I dislike about modern America as well, but not things that make me. They're things that make me think that our country can be improved and reformed, not things that make me scorn it.
You and your colleagues at National Review just a few months ago put out your own manifesto as you relaunched the print edition of National Review. I thought it was a compelling and incredibly well-written statement of National Review's principles. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that and the deliberation that went into writing that document?
Yeah, there is some danger with people who write for a living that you get three of them together and you end up with four manifestos. What we thought was important is that there is on the left and on the right different forms of rejection of America's founding principle and our founding documents, with some folks on the illiberal right really frankly saying that the Constitution was a kind of experiment that failed. And some people on the left, I think we're all familiar with this kind of critique, saying that kind of, in a way, the Constitution was always a kind of sham. So we wanted to write a statement of where we think that most people, if not always most vocal people, are, which believes that those founding principles and those founding documents contained a great deal of wisdom that remains worth defending and applying today.
What's your assessment, Ramesh, of this point about what Trump will eventually leave the scene, one assumes, right? In theory, he could lose in 24, run again in 28, lose in 28, run again in 30. It could be like literally we're on Medicare and Trump is still running for president. But my base case is coming around to the idea that when Trump is gone, the most important thing is how many of these ideological debates, how that plays out after Trump has left the stage. How do you feel? Do you feel that that's true? Do you feel like that debate is still an open question? How do you feel like what is the future of nationalism and Trumpism once Trump is not the main character in the play?
I think that Trump was very good at tearing down and destroying an old conservative and Republican formula, program, and agenda, but was not good or even particularly interested at creating a new one. And so I think a lot of things remain up for grabs. So, for example, on trade, I don't think that the Republican Party is overall a protectionist party. I think it's going to have, even post-Trump, a larger protectionist wing than it used to have. That's not totally unprecedented, but it will have a larger such wing than it had in, say, 2012. But I think that a lot of these debates are still going to be ongoing. He doesn't really want to settle them, and he can't settle them because he's not really interested in, a particular set of principles or policy objectives. I mean, think about immigration, right? Possibly a signature issue. He tanks a deal to get funding for the wall, partly because he wants sharp cuts in legal immigration. And then a year later, he comes out in a State of the Union address for record levels of legal immigration. This is not a Barry Goldwater in terms of having a strict ideology that he's working hard to promote.
And how about you, Jessica? So how do you feel about, do you see that, do you feel like the policy environment has shifted in the conservative world? Do you feel like it's those free market core principles are still active? How do you think Trump's eventual departure from the scene, should it happen at some point in our lifetimes, how will that all play out?
Well, at the risk of giving away my age, I feel like I've been working as a protector of free enterprise for decades now in DC. Oh. We've always been a little on the outskirts of the Republicans. I was just saying to another speaker here today, I don't know what I was upset about 8 or 10 years ago. I remember being upset and thinking, this is ridiculous. Maybe it was about spending? I don't know, but I was upset with Republicans.
That's very quaint to be concerned about spending.
Isn't that? Now? Those were the days. They tell me during Ronald Reagan, I was young during Ronald Reagan, I'm going to give myself that, that it was a more unified friendship on the right between conservative social values and a real support of markets. It's been a little strained. I mean, I think it's been going in that direction a long time. And while Mr. Trump has some stuff on energy and that would be in accordance with market principles, most of it's not. It's a much more sort of state-driven capitalism. And I guess that's what I worry about as well. This is not, that America is awesome is not guaranteed, right? It's awesome for a reason. It's awesome because Americans are awesome. Weird group of folks that we are, I love it. But also because we have a sort of set of principles, and some of those are institutions and social norms. But, because I work on it, it seems bigger to me that it's our system of how things work in economics in this country, and it works really well. There could be improvements, there are problems, there are a lot of problems that I could identify as government sources of problems. But we are an incredibly prosperous, wealthy, and economically free society compared to most of the people who've ever lived on Earth. And that's not a given. I mean, we have to all keep deciding that every election, right? Every generation has to be convinced of the merits of that system, and not just that it works well, because it does work well, it's objectively true, it works really well, but that there's other values represented in that, right? There's fairness, and there's all these other things that might be more or less important to a bunch of different, every American has their sort of emphasis. They want it to be fair, or it's important to be loyal, or we have to speak, when we speak about the free enterprise system, we need to hit all those marks, because I wish all of America just thought like we do, and this is great. I might never leave. I might follow some of you home. This is a much friendlier crowd than I'm used to talking to. It's great. But we need to start talking now about people who need convincing on this stuff, right? And the Trump movement has taken that in a different direction, right? Just last week, there was the Capital One Discover merger announced, which I'm just gonna tell you folks, by the way, it's gonna be one more major credit card, it's gonna be great, and your points are all safe, so you know. But we had, who were the two members of Senate we heard from coming out saying, you better stop this right now, regulators? Elizabeth Warren and who am I thinking of from? Josh Hawley. See, my brain won't even say his name. And Josh Hawley, who, they came out swinging for this. And I just thought, what in the world? I mean, if that isn't the horseshoe of things, right? And that has to be dealt with, I think, no matter what happens in the next election, which, once again, I'm not allowed legally to say anything about.
And I should be very clear about this. I mean, the Freedom Conservatism Project is not a Never Trump project. There are people who are Never Trumpers who've signed the document. There are people who served in the Trump administration who've signed the document. I mean, because the whole point of the project is not so much to litigate Trump versus Never Trump or what have you. It's more about what are the underlying principles that the conservative movement should stand for. And there is an argument to be made that much of, if not all of, the policy success in the Trump presidency came from the Freecon wing of the Trump administration. All those judicial appointments that came from the Federalist Society, what the Natcons often deride as Conservatism, Inc., that was a 50-year project to put constitutionalist judges on the court. The deregulatory initiative in the Trump administration, that was, a lot of that was basically ideas from organizations like CEI and others that were putting those ideas into practice. The tax cuts, though they were not paired with spending cuts, unfortunately, were represented several decades of free market thinking about tax reform on the right. So the irony is that for all the political noise around Trump and around the nationalists, the policy wins from the Trump administration are almost entirely on the Freecon side. And so I will tell you that among the signatories, there are people among the signatories of the Freedom Conservatism Statement of Principles who will vote for Trump and who believe that Trump in a second term will be like the first term, that there will be lots of bad things, but there will be some good things too, and that it'll be better than Biden. You hear that argument from some of the signatories, just to be very transparent with you. Then there are others who are like, Trump is terrible, we've got to get rid of him. It's better to lose in 24 if you think of yourself as a Republican and have a more Freecon candidate in the future if Nikki Haley is not able to pull it out this time around. So the views politically are diverse and on a number of spectrums. One on the Trump side, and also from a standpoint of, Jessica and I were talking backstage about the blue-haired libertarians and the more traditional conservatives who are more socially conservative, say, or more sort of traditional three-legged stool conservatives. So we have the whole range of people, but we're all united in terms of really believing that constitutional liberty is really central to what makes America great, and that's the thing that's important to preserve. What we should talk about the presidential race a little bit, and not just, the current one, but if we look throughout history, and National Review knows this better than almost anyone, if you look at whether it's Goldwater and Reagan in the 60s and 80s or 70s, 60s through 80s, or whether it's Bill Clinton on the Democratic side when the Democratic Leadership Council came along and said, we're tired of losing to Republicans, let's have a more moderate centrist Democratic Party. It seems pretty clear that for these intellectual movements to succeed, there needs to be a flag bearer who ordinary people can point to and say, okay, I'm not going to read these long manifestos, but I am going to look at this candidate, this presidential candidate, and say that's the person who I'm following. Ramesh, is there anybody you see out there who you think clearly is the flag bearer for Freedom Conservatism? And maybe there's multiple people you think of in that regard, or maybe it's a spectrum, a gradation. How do you think about that?
For the last 8 or 9 years, I've often thought of Kafka, there is hope, but not for us.
A lot of gallows humor at this conference, right?
Look, I would say because you've got this kind of unformed Republican Party at this point and a kind of unformed conservatism, that it's a time that should reward entrepreneurship and in some ways has. And we're going to just have to see who ends up leading the charge. I would say that I have had high hopes for quite a number of people over the last few years, and they have either left lick life or decided to throw in their lot with, I think, really unfortunate tendencies in American politics. So one bit of conservative wisdom I think we always need to remember is put not your faith in princes.
Are you if Nikki Haley does end up not winning the Republican nomination, which seems still very likely, do you think would your advice to her be to suck it up and endorse Trump and be a good loyal Republican soldier, or would it be to not endorse Trump and stick it out? I'm just asking I'm asking the question. I'm asking the question. Yeah. Right. Well, let's let Ramesh. We're here to hear Ramesh talk. Let's hear what his point of view on this is. What's his political advice? Sure. I appreciate the feedback. Thank you.
I would say I don't see how you can say that somebody is not just mistaken, not just flawed, but unhinged. Right. That is the word she has used recently. Correctly, and then go on and endorse that person for president. Now, I have seen plenty of Republicans perform that kind of maneuver before, but it is certainly one that is hard to respect. All I can say is I don't have it within my power to choose who is going to be the next president, but I can decide who I'm not going to endorse.
Yeah. Bill Buckley wrote a book once, Cancel Your Own Goddamn Subscription, dealing with all the people who would complain about his editorials that they didn't like. Have you guys, I assume that National Review has dealt with a lot of this too in the Trump era of, you had your famous Never Trump issue, you kind of coined the term really, you should have charged royalties, and here you are 8 years later. How, institutionally, what has that been like as a leader of National Review, and how do you feel you've navigated that?
It's been tons of fun. Look, a lot of readers were unhappy in 2016 with our opposition to Trump. And I think at this point, our readers are, if they either agree with us or they're resigned to are continuing to disagree about Trump. Although there's a range of opinion. We certainly had people who voted for him in 2016 and 2020. We ran debates on this subject. Andy McCarthy was, for example, making the case in 2020 for voting for Trump. I made the case for not doing that. Andy eventually came around after January 6th. He said, "Okay, Ramesh, you were right." And it takes a big man to admit that I'm right. Look, what I would say is our readership is not a MAGA readership, but it is a partisan Republican readership. And so when we are not pulling our oar with the Republican Party, that becomes a point of friction. But our job is not to be a Republican organ, it's to be a conservative intellectual magazine. Right.
And how about at CEI and your window into the Libertarian movement? This has been true in the Libertarian movement to a degree as well. How do you feel like Libertarian institutions are navigating that tension?
Well, I think if you look across town, you can see which think tanks have thrown their lot in with certain candidate. We escape a lot of that because we just work on economic regulation, but not all of it, because we have a couple of things that we're known for, besides our tech regulation work, obviously, is also our work on energy. And we're very free market on energy. And I think the libertarian group generally, and certainly CEI is a microcosm of this, it would be really hard to give you a definition because it encompasses a lot of different things. And we kind of pride ourselves on the tolerance of that and working together on the common goals. But even in that, there's a little bit of a division, right? The progressive right is very interested in interfering with the marketplace on tech issues and very pro-market on energy. So there were a few awkward moments in the kitchenette early on, but that's just the way it goes. I mean, again, your job is to tell your truth, to make your argument, to present your set of facts. And that does not involve thinking that people who disagree with you are bad people. That just says we disagree. And as long as we can keep having those conversations, that's, I think, what we're all here to do. If I can't persuade you with my reason, then, I've lost fair and square. So.
That's a great segue to my last question here. We got 3 minutes, which is to each of you, and if either you can go first. What are the one or two things you think that the freedom conservative movement, defined loosely, not merely the signatories, but the broader ecosystem, what are the top one or two things you think we should do to expand our constituency, and particularly to regain and reattract the people who've been taken by Trump and the nationalists?
Sure. Well, look, there are different kinds of Trump supporters. There are different reasons that people have for supporting Trump. To the extent that there is a significant group of people who feel that they're not listened to, that the ruling powers of the last 20 years have not done things with their interests in mind, I think we need to show that there's a conservative program out there that can expand opportunity for everyone, that doesn't just relegate them to yesterday, and make just make the case that we are not into the free market just because it helps rich people and big business, but that there are opportunities here for everybody.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think part of the problem with a lot of different factions is that they just kind of are dismissive of people's complaints. And I don't think that's very American of us, right? I'm not here to tell you there aren't any problems. I'm here to try to explain to you what the market solutions might be and what the dangers are of letting more government help you try to solve those might be. And I think you have to start listening to each other. Like I just said, you just can't say someone disagrees with me, they're awful. I mean, that's not what we're doing here, right? We're supposed to be able to agree on a certain amount of things that we're going to have to hash out together, and maybe on a number of things kind of leave each other alone, which I would also recommend. But there has to be some common ground, and it won't get accomplished any other way but with a certain amount of compassion and grace and kind of giving ourselves the opportunity to get back together. Right? We can't just stay mad and angry. I think that's the thing, you said it, that I hear most is there's so much anger.
People have a right to be angry, right? I mean, if they're working just as hard to stay in place economically, the cost of living keeps going up, and their wages are barely keeping pace. That's one of the reasons why in the Statement of Principles and Freedom Conservatism, we talk about that. We say we commit to an agenda of applying free market principles to the challenges that ordinary people face.
And that's exactly right, because those are solutions, not revenge. And we need to get off the revenge motivations, and we need to get back to what works.
I like getting along as much as anybody, maybe more. But there are also people who like being angry. And I think that is a force in our politics that is a serious problem.
That's for sure. Well, that'll have to be a topic for another day. We are the hope and the happy warriors on this panel. Thank you very much. Again, freedomconservatism.org if you want to learn more about what we're up to. Thank you.